All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're covering a massive 16,000 years of Canadian history today. We're going to look at how an ancient, completely frozen glacial landscape was transformed over millennia into the modern, multicultural powerhouse we know today. It's a really incredible story, one of migration, immense geographical challenges, and honestly, a whole lot of compromise.
To really wrap your head around Canada, you first have to grasp its immense, almost unfathomable scale. Imagine a landmass so vast it spans 3.8 million square miles. It literally crosses 6 entirely different time zones. It's the second largest nation on the planet. And to put that into perspective, this vastness encompasses everything from the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains and the super flat expanses of the prairies, all the way to the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest and the frozen tundras up in the Arctic Circle. This staggering, wildly diverse geography, that's the stage where this entire history plays out.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll go from the Ice Age to the Vikings, check out the clash between the French and British empires, look at what it means to live next to America, cover the expansion of the Canadian Dominion, and wrap up with Canada becoming a modern nation.
Section 1. From the Ice Age to the Vikings.
Let's start way back, roughly 16,000 years ago. That's when the Beringia land bridge first allowed humans to cross over from eastern Siberia straight into North America. Now, as the Ice Age glaciers melted and sea levels rose, that bridge vanished, completely cutting North America off from Asia. But the retreat of those massive ice sheets opened up incredibly distinct new worlds, and the geography brilliantly dictated how people lived. In the east, you had the Algonquian and Iroquoian peoples ranging all the way down the forested seaboard. On the plains, the Cree lived as nomad hunters, following these vast, wandering herds of bison. Out west, the Naudane and Salishan peoples sustained themselves on abundant salmon and built incredible homes from giant cedar trees. And way up in the frozen north, the Inuit thrived all the way from Alaska over to Greenland.
Now here's a really fascinating twist. European discovery actually predates Columbus by nearly 500 years. No way, right? But in the early 11th century, Vikings, like Leif Erikson, ventured westward from Greenland. Erikson established what they called Vinland, which is believed to be Lonzo Meadows up in Newfoundland. But honestly, the immense distance from Scandinavia just made it unviable, so those settlements were deliberately abandoned by the 12th century. It actually wasn't until 1497, when John Cabot arrived for the English crown, that Europeans laid eyes on North America again.
Moving on to Section 2, the French and British Empires.
Fast forward to the 16th and 17th centuries, this vast territory suddenly becomes the ultimate prize for Europe's greatest competing empires. Back in 1534, the French explorer Jacques Cartier made the first major colonial moves right into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He claimed the territory for France, and he actually gave it a name derived directly from a local Native American word meaning settlement, Canada. Later on, guys like Samuel de Champlain mapped the territory, founded Quebec in 1608, and started a slow but very steady trickle of French immigrants into what they called New France.
But by the early 18th century, a massive geographical collision was totally inevitable. See, the French controlled the vast inland waterways. We're talking the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, all the way down the Mississippi. But the British, they had them completely boxed in from the north and the east, thanks to the Hudson's Bay Company and those 13 expanding colonies along the eastern seaboard. A major conflict over territory and resources was absolutely unavoidable at this point.
And that tension climaxed with the French and Indian War, which kicked off in 1754. The French slowly lost ground here. The British actually expelled the French-speaking Acadians from Nova Scotia. Then, in 1759, the very heart of New France itself, Quebec, fell at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. By 1763, France was roundly defeated and formally gave up all mainland claims in North America. But here's a fascinating detail for you. To keep the peace, the British actually allowed the newly conquered French-speaking populations in Quebec to keep their property, their Catholic religion, their language, and their legal customs. And a lot of those traditions remain firmly in place today.
All right, Section 3. Living next to America.
So, while Britain had firmly secured Canada, they were about to face a massive, world-altering rebellion literally right next door. The American Revolution broke out in 1775, and, ironically enough, it really helped unify a distinctly Canadian identity. While the Americans fought for independence, most folks in Canada remained loyal to Britain, and they successfully repelled an American invasion of Quebec. When that war ended in 1783, British troops and American loyalists who didn't want to live in the new United States fled north.
This huge, sudden influx of English speakers prompted the British, in 1791, to divide Quebec into two parts, the largely French-speaking Lower Canada and the English-speaking Upper Canada, setting up its capital at York, which, if you're wondering, is modern-day Toronto.
But peace didn't last forever. Tensions over American westward expansion and British trade restrictions led right into the War of 1812. The Americans launched invasions across the northern border, and the war was pretty much characterized by 3 whole years of back-and-forth attacks. Ultimately, the borders remained completely unchanged. Neither side made any meaningful gains. But the lasting legacy of this whole conflict was a mutual agreement to demilitarize the US-Canada boundary. Basically, both sides realized that compromise was infinitely better than endless conflict, and that created the longest undefended border in the world, an arrangement that still profoundly shapes North America today.
Section 4. Expanding the Canadian Dominion. Now let's see how this kind of patchwork of colonies builds into the unified political entity we recognize today. By the mid-19th century, faced with growing pressures from a rapidly expanding United States and dealing with internal demands for better democratic governance, these separate colonies realized they were way stronger together. So, on July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was officially formed. It became a fully self-governing polity within the British Empire, and Ottawa was established as its capital.
The new Canadian government aggressively pushed westward to consolidate control, but man, this created immense growing pains. This was not a peaceful settlement. It met some really fierce resistance. The Métis, a people of joint First Nations and European descent led by Louis Riel, fought against Canadian incursions during the Red River and Northwest rebellions. The government ultimately suppressed those uprisings, and they used that momentum to build a physical spine for this fractured nation. I'm talking about the completion of the massive Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885. Treaties were negotiated to rapidly open up the prairies, which happened just in time for the chaotic lure of the Klondike Gold Rush to bring 100,000 prospectors up north, finally formalizing boundaries with Alaska.
Now, as we examine this rapid expansion, we absolutely must address its severe consequences for First Nations peoples. Indigenous communities were often forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and placed onto reserves. At the same time, the government launched some very dark assimilationist programs, most notably the residential school system. This system was specifically aimed at extinguishing native languages and cultures among Indigenous children to forcefully integrate them into Canadian society. It's a heavy, crucial part of the history to understand.
And our final section, Section 5. Becoming a modern nation. As we enter the 20th century, Canada steps fully onto the world stage, securing its ultimate sovereignty through immense contributions to global conflicts. When World War I broke out in 1914, Canada, since it was still part of the British Empire, was automatically drawn in. The war was a massive paradox for the young nation. On one hand, it forged incredible unity and a strong pro-Anglophone Canadian identity through devastating but successful engagements on the Western Front, like the famous Battle of Vimy Ridge. But on the other hand, it caused deep internal division. French Canadians felt largely alienated from what they saw as Britain's war, and they vehemently protested the government's military conscription policies between 1917 and 1918.
By the time the Second World War arrived in 1939, Canada was acting with much more autonomy. Yet they still answered the call to arms to support Britain once again. And here is just an incredible fact from our research. The threat of a full-scale German invasion of the British Isles was so high that an operation called Operation Fish was executed. Britain secretly shipped a massive portion of its gold reserves and financial wealth, get this, equivalent to a staggering $56 billion in today's money, straight across the submarine-infested Atlantic to Canada for safekeeping. It literally remains the largest transfer of wealth in human history. The British military even drafted the Coates Mission, which was a totally secret plan to evacuate the British royal family to Canada if the homeland fell. Wild, right?
The post-war decades rapid-fired Canada right into modernity, as the country actively stepped out of Britain's shadow. Domestically, they built a robust welfare state, complete with universal health care and old-age pensions. Globally, as the Cold War intensified, Canada co-founded NATO and partnered with the US to form NORAD for joint aerospace defense. They finally closed the colonial chapter for good by adopting the iconic maple leaf flag as the national emblem in 1965. And finally, with the Constitution Act of 1982, Canada formally severed its final legal ties to Britain. They gained total legislative independence while keeping the monarch solely as a ceremonial head of state.
And that brings us right to the present day. We want to leave you with this final thought. When you look at Canada today, realize you are seeing a nation forged not by singular conquest, but by centuries of necessary coexistence. From those very first steps across the Beringia land bridge, through the clash of massive global empires, to the sheer logistical challenges of carving a unified country out of the second-largest landmass on Earth, Canada's identity is deeply rooted in resilience, respect, and a common understanding of differences. So what do you think? How will this unique legacy of continuous migration and compromise guide Canada's future on the global stage? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and remember, keep asking the big questions.